Good morning. It is my pleasure to have Theodora Stringham with us this morning. She spoke to our Breakfast Bar series on issues of cannabis, drug testing, employees in the workspace, and as the title implies, it is a complex landscape. So thank you for coming to talk with us this morning. Theo is my partner from our Tyson's Corner office and is part of the Labor and Employment Group here at Alfred Kerman. So, there were certain terms I heard throughout the course of your presentation this morning, and I guess I want to have a better understanding of what they are and what they apply to. And so they were fitness for duty, disability, workplace accommodations. And so I guess if we start with disability, I assume is as good a place to start as any.
Certainly.
In the context of cannabis use, drug use, opioids are something we hear about all the time. How do those issues fit into the definition of a disability for purposes of what we're talking about?
So the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which is a federal agency overseeing employment issues, has defined disability as it relates to cannabis and marijuana, specifically as in terms of former addicts and people who are not currently addicted or who are in recovery. And so disability, I'll just define it in the general sense, is a condition that substantially limits a major life activity. And the Americans with Disabilities Act says that you can't discriminate against someone because they have a disability. The caveat to that is that the individual still must be able to perform the essential functions of their job. So with respect to cannabis, if someone was formerly addicted to cannabis or marijuana and discloses that to you, then you must then speak with them about what, if any, reasonable accommodation they may need for that former addiction that they are in recovery for. You don't have to totally change your business to accommodate them, but you do need to talk to them about it and see once that issue is broached.
So the reason for the conversation then that you're talking about, as I understand it, is to assess you, the employer's capability to reasonably accommodate their condition, their disability. Is that correct?
Correct.
So can you give some examples of, what a reasonable accommodation might be?
Sure. So in a more simple sense, if you have carpal tunnel syndrome and you say, I need a elevated keyboard that's going to be ergonomic and help me type better and not have less pain, that would be reasonable because it's probably easily accessible for the employer. It's not going to change the business. It's not what the law calls an undue hardship on the business. It helps them do their job. They can still do their job in every respective way. It's just some extra help.
So in the circumstance where that particular individual, let's just say, was the only person in a small business who did the job that they did, would that be then become an unreasonable accommodation because of the impact on the business if that person was not able to continue to do his or her job with the accommodation?
Yes, it could. It could very well be. If the impact of the fact that their ability not to do the essential functions of their job is the business can't function, then that would be an undue hardship. So it is truly a case-by-case basis or analysis that you need to look at for every issue or every notice that you receive of a disability.
So when we talk about a workplace accommodation, you've just talked about the scenario of an elevated keyboard, for instance. So I suppose one might ask the question, whose job is it to ascertain whether an employee has a disability? There are rights and obligations on each side of the equation, right? If we have a disability, is it the burden, I guess is the right word, of the employee to bring it to the attention of the employer? Or is it the burden of the employer to sort of investigate and vet to determine whether or not there is a disability at work?
So at the the first instance of notification, it is on the employee to make the employer aware that they have a disability, and therefore then the burden kicks in on the employer side to talk with them about that. But the employer does not need to go around and ask everyone, are you disabled? In fact, they shouldn't. There should be a policy in place that is readily accessible where the employees, everyone knows that if you have a disability, if you need some extra help, you're going to do X, Y, and Z as outlined in the policy, so there's no ambiguity and everyone knows there's somewhere they can go if they in fact have a disability and need some extra help.
So when you talk about a policy, you are talking about something in writing.
Yes.
I assume that is distributed to all employees.
Correct.
And would that policy typically address, or should it typically address, issues of drug testing, which come up a lot in the employment arena?
Absolutely, yes. Any policy, any handbook that you may have on your with respect to your work site should talk about drug testing, should make it clear, the policy. As we talked about today, Linda, in Maryland, there's very strict requirements as it relates to drug testing. So it's good to spell those out in the policy itself, so that everybody knows, from those implementing the test to those receiving the test, what should be done, and that it's all above board. There's no question that if there's drug testing, this is what's going to happen and when.
So one of the questions that was asked this morning was a scenario where, let's assume I have had an employee for 3 years and I've had no problems, and I have a drug-free workplace, and at year 3, this individual has now a script for an opioid or a script for marijuana that is having an impact in the workplace. How should that come to your attention? Is it appropriate to put into a policy, for instance, that if you begin to use some particular drug or prescription, or however we define that you have an obligation to report that to me? What is the best practice to deal with a scenario where we've got an employee whose circumstances change with respect to marijuana or some other medicinal use?
So I would say best practice, and it does depend on what your personal preferences are for your workspace, is to have a zero tolerance policy. And if there is a need for a prescription, as you reference, and it impacts the ability to do work, you can put in your policy that if there's any conditions or disability or otherwise that impact your ability to do work, you need to make your employer aware of that. And I would say that comes into specific play with certain jobs where there is a safety component, for example. Mm-hmm. And we talked about today, operating heavy machinery. Mm-hmm. If you are undertaking or now have a prescription for opioids, you arguably should not be operating heavy machinery. And so there's a level of complexity, but also liability that comes forward for both the employee and the employer. And that needs to be something that's vetted and made aware, as soon as possible, because you're compromising safety.
So it sounds like sort of if we were to oversimplify the takeaway.
Yes.
And this is a very complex issue, obviously, with a lot of elements to it. But it sounds like if we were to oversimplify, the biggest and best thing an employer can do is to have a good, thorough written policy mm-hmm. that lays everything out, so there's total clarity and transparency about what should happen and what procedures are and so forth, especially when there's so much liability associated with a failure to comply with all this.
Absolutely. A good policy that's regularly trained upon, training sessions, particularly given updates in the law. It's good to have training sessions every year, twice a year at least, to reinforce the policy. And that's going to go a long way in protecting yourselves and making sure that it's a safe and compliant workplace.
Okay, so you just mentioned training. Who should an employer be training mm-hmm. on the policies? Is it just the managers? Is it all the employees? Who is it who should be trained?
I think everyone. And in terms of implementation of, say, something like a reasonable accommodation process and the oversight of, say, medical records, there may be tailored portions of a presentation for higher level management. But overall, everyone should know what the process is and the policy is. So I recommend that everyone gets the training as it relates to these issues.
Okay, so that generates another question.
Okay.
And you just mentioned medical records. Is it commonplace if we're dealing with the disability, if we're dealing with trying to make a workplace accommodation, is it appropriate to ask an employee for medical records with regard to a condition that requires this kind of accommodation?
It is appropriate. And so generally, we recommend that the employer has, again, the policy, and generally there'll be a form, and in the form we say something to the effect of, and please provide medical documentation for your request for a reasonable accommodation. And the doctor may write something up that sort of says why this person needs it from a medical perspective. And so that is appropriate, and it is most helpful and compliant to have a certain set of eyes that look at that and not just have that left out on the front desk or in reception. You want to guard that information, but certainly you can ask for it.
I believe this morning you mentioned in particular a confidential employee file that might be a file into which medical records are put so that, like you say, they're not accessible to all eyes.
Absolutely, yes.
Great.
Very good to have that separate confidential file.
Thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you.
Complex subject, one that is really out there changing and has a lot of different elements to it. But I appreciate you coming this morning to share with us the benefit of your expertise on the subject.
Thank you so much for inviting me, Linda. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Thank you.